let's move directly to our top story. The Labour Party has insisted the rebellion by the party's frontbenchers over an Israel-Hamas ceasefire was confined to a small number and that the party remains united. 8 shadow frontbenchers were among a total of 56 Labour MPs who voted for a ceasefire in the Commons last night. Those on the front bench either resigned in advance of the vote or were sacked. They included Jess Phillips, MP for Birmingham Yardley, who quit as the Shadow Minister for Domestic Violence, as she said, with a heavy heart after what she described as one of the toughest weeks in politics. Earlier today, Deputy Leader Angela Rayner posted on X, "We all want the violence to end. I understand and respect those calling for a ceasefire now, and I'm deeply sorry to have lost valued colleagues from the front bench." Joining me in the studio now, Chief Political Correspondent at The Times, Aubrey Allegretti. Thanks for coming, Aubrey. And down the line, we're joined by the editor of The Labour List, Tom Belger, and former Labour Party official Richard Power Said. Good to have you both on the show. Let's start with Aubrey. Aubrey, how significant or serious is this for Keir Starmer? And could he have avoided this kind of thing? Was there a cleverer, more diplomatic way of playing this, perhaps?
It's been a really rocky 24 hours for Labour, and I've spoken to MPs who voted both for and abstained on the ceasefire motion, and they're all feeling incredibly bruised. People on both sides said, "I cried myself to sleep last night. I sort of fear for what comes next, and I don't know what to do."
What do they mean? What do they mean they fear for what comes next?
Well, I think they fear for partly their safety. I don't know how founded those concerns are, but people have suggested that if they didn't vote for a ceasefire, they think that protesters might potentially kind of put their lives or their families' lives at risk in some way. I don't know whether that's true, but that's how they're feeling and how they've told me they're feeling today.
Seriously, they were physically intimidated and frightened at the thought that if they didn't vote for the ceasefire, there might be repercussions.
Absolutely.
Not the other way around, not that if they did vote for a ceasefire, there'd be repercussions.
That's correct, yes. And so they're all feeling very bruised, and the Labour Party is a bit of a difficult place to be right now. Now, having said that, there have been these 8 resignations, and Keir Starmer ultimately politically thinks he's doing the right thing, and he probably morally thinks he's doing the right thing as well. We haven't seen yet any sort of huge swing in the polls to suggest that his attitude of trying to stick with the UK government's stance is hurting him, and so I think we're likely to see Labour's position stand pretty firm unless the situation in Gaza changes considerably.
And do you feel that this whole interlude is kind of almost moot, because it's not as if Keir Starmer's view, the SNP's view, each individual Labour MP or shadow minister's view will have any impact at all upon the Israeli government or the Israeli IDF's actions, or indeed on Gaza or Hamas. Nobody's going to take any notice. Nobody's going to be influenced by it. So what difference does it really make? Why is it all so significant? Could Keir Starmer have somehow avoided this?
Keir Starmer certainly does have a sort of presence. If he were pushing for a ceasefire, it would put pressure on the UK government. Having said that, it is certainly true to say that when you look at, for example, the poll from Savanta today of UK Muslims, they say that the net dissatisfaction with Rishi Sunak's reaction to Israel and Palestine is twice that of Keir Starmer's. So it seems that people care a lot more about what the ministers, the people in charge, are doing and saying than what Keir Starmer, who is obviously the leader of the opposition, does and says.
All right, let's bring Tom Belger into this. Hello, Tom. Thanks for joining us. How significant is this for Rishi Sunak? How much impact will this have on the Labour Party as a whole, and most particularly, of course, on potential voters' view of the Labour Party?
Yeah, well, as Aubrey said, significant for both Labour and the Tories, even though the media is obviously focused a bit more on Labour. That I know the party were kind of trying to say, or John Healey, Shadow Minister, was trying to say this morning that it's a small rebellion, but 56 Labour MPs, that I think is more than a quarter of all Labour MPs defying a strict instruction to vote a particular way. Similarly, on the front bench, those 10 people who left, that's about a tenth of Labour's whole shadow team of people that Starmer thought were up to managing posts and staying loyal in government. You could say on the flip side, obviously, that there'll be a focus on the challenges this presents for Starmer. I've heard some people say on the flip side, if you're cynical and a supporter of Starmer, you'd say, well, maybe it's a good thing to have a test of loyalty now when you're not in power than it is in power and face, resignations when the government potentially has a bit more sway with Labour in power. But as was flagged before, the real level of influence Labour has over this is pretty limited. So while I think you'll see, in the coming weeks, maybe at a local level, we've reported continually on Labour List about local councils, constituency Labour parties voting for a ceasefire. You would imagine the media is not going to keep on focusing quite as much potentially on after this vote on the unrest in Labour, but maybe that's unwise to say at the moment, because maybe people would have said that a couple of weeks ago, and yet the focus has dragged on Labour. Finally, though, as Aubrey also mentioned, not done too much damage to Labour. It has done some, but you'd think, given the level of media focus, it'd do more damage. But actually, a 27-point lead in a poll for Labour this morning. And even another poll of Muslim voters, got to take some of these polls with caution, but 2/3 of those saying they will vote Labour. And Gaza only ranks 4th amongst concerns that might affect how people vote. So as one pollster said, some of those suggestions that Labour has kind of fractured its relationship with all Muslims everywhere for good are probably pretty exaggerated.
That's fascinating, isn't it? That's fascinating that Gaza comes forth in the concerns of the Muslims who responded to that research and to that poll. Fascinating. Let's bring in Richard Saeed on this. Richard, your experience, bring that to bear on what's going on in the Labour Party. Do you feel as if Keir Starmer has been in an invidious position? He couldn't avoid putting himself in that position, and he's had to simply deal with the fallout in whichsoever way he could, which is, kind of try and ignore it, really.
That's interesting. I don't know if he's tried to ignore it, but I think he's tried to run a slightly precarious course on it, and it's mostly worked for him in the sense that he still appears to have his authority. He's put that stamp on the party pretty well over the last few years, and he still has it. I suppose, you're asking me about my personal experience as a party official. I know that when you're in the middle of these kinds of arguments, it can feel like the most important thing in the world. And I think Aubrey's, sources have indicated that that is how people are feeling. But in a few weeks' time, I'd be really surprised if this feels like a major political event. Instead, we should be focusing on the terrible, terrible things that are happening in the Middle East right now, the appalling evils committed by Hamas and the terrible slaughter of Palestinian civilians that's taking place now. That's what matters. I don't really think that the impact on the Labour Party is going to be great, and I don't think it really matters compared to what's happening in the Middle East.
Let me ask you a little bit, all three of you, about what you imagine. I know this is surmising and theorising, but we all know that our own Piers Morgan has just interviewed Jeremy Corbyn, and we know that Piers persistently asked him to condemn Hamas and to identify Hamas as terrorists, neither of which he would do. And Piers asked him repeatedly. Piers is a pretty fearless interviewer. He really does go in where other interviewers might fear to tread. And he was being absolutely steadfast and not shifting his ground. But just to imagine, I know it's hypothetical, I get that obviously, that what would be happening now, do you think, if Jeremy Corbyn were still leader of the Labour Party?
It would be incredibly difficult, because I think if you thought that 9 resignations over the leadership stance on Israel and Gaza was a lot now, I imagine that you might see multitudes of resignations if MPs were sort of under Jeremy Corbyn's leadership. And he would obviously have tried to navigate this as well. I've spoken to people who worked in Corbyn's office and said it was really difficult sometimes to try and work with him, to try and tame him, to sort of not quickly rush to judgment, but to try and step back and not just say what you want to say, but also say what you have to say. And they feel that he did that to a degree when he was in office, although he was much criticised when he was there as well. But yeah, I think we'd be seeing a lot more levels of unrest if Jeremy Corbyn was still running the Labour Party.
I wonder what you think, Tom, about that. I mean, obviously, we don't have to face that situation. It isn't the situation that's currently something we've got to grapple with. But just to imagine it, because he is still vivid, he is still speaking. He's just given a big interview here at TalkTV to my colleague and friend Piers Morgan. What do you make of it? What would have happened had he remained at the helm?
I think Aubrey's absolutely right. Although I would say, given where we are, nearly 2024, and given the rate at which shadow ministers were resigning under Corbyn, I think he would have been in a shadow cabinet all on his own at this point, with no one left to quit. It's as you say, even with Starmer, it really is remarkable this far into his project, when he's purged, a lot of the people who didn't want around him, left of the party, really feeling defeated, that even now there's this scale of rebellion. And important to say, it's not just the left of the party. I guess underlines that just how important this issue is, but also, the scale of divides on this and many other issues, Labour always being a broad church, and underlines the fact that maybe whoever leader, these issues are always going to be difficult for the Labour Party.
And let me just ask Richard, because he's been on the very inside, so he has a clear view of what might have transpired had Corbyn remained head of the Labour Party. What do you think?
Well, bear in mind that when Jeremy Corbyn was leader of the Labour Party, he continued the party's long tradition of supporting NATO membership. He continued the party's long tradition of supporting the UK's use of a nuclear deterrent. Those aren't things that he personally believes in. He's got a very long established position on them, but he very quickly took a far more pragmatic approach on those foreign and military, foreign and defence policy issues, because that was what was politically necessary for him as leader of the opposition. So I actually think that his position as leader now in this hypothetical universe that you're describing would be rather different to any position that he's taking at the moment. I'm sure certainly he would be describing Hamas as terrorists, but yeah, probably he would be, I'm sure he would be advocating for a ceasefire.